The moment Travis Ellison saw the latest safety report, his stomach dropped. Burn injuries, exhaustion-related mistakes, and a growing list of worker complaints. This wasn't the company he built. 15 years ago, Travis had started his welding and metal fabrication business with nothing but a rented garage and a second-hand welding torch. Through grit and long hours, he expanded to 9 locations across the Midwest. He prided himself on quality craftsmanship and taking care of his people. But lately, reports from his managers didn't match the values he built the company on. Workers were quitting, accidents were increasing, and customers were noticing the decline in quality. His district manager, Kevin, kept brushing off concerns. Labor shortages, Travis, it's the same everywhere. People don't want to work anymore. But Travis wasn't buying it. If people were walking out, there had to be a reason. And if the reports were true, his employees were being pushed to dangerous limits. So he made a decision. He would go undercover as a new trainee. Since his company had grown so much, most employees had never met him face to face. He shaved his beard, dyed his hair a lighter brown, and ditched his usual button-downs for worn jeans and a basic work jacket. His ID badge read Tom Ellis. He chose to start at one of his busiest shops, the one with the highest injury rate. The moment he walked into the warehouse, the heat hit him like a wall. Sparks flew from welding stations, the air thick with smoke and metal. The sound of grinding and hammering echoed through the space. A man in his mid-50s, stocky with a graying buzz cut, waved him over. "You the new guy?" "Yeah, hey," Travis said. "Tom." "I'm Ray, your shift lead. No time for chit-chat. Grab a mask, gloves, and get to work." Travis fell into step, watching the workers around him. They moved fast, too fast. Some barely took breaks, their faces streaked with sweat and exhaustion. A younger guy, maybe early 20s, worked beside him. His name tag read Derek. Dark circles clung under his eyes, and his hands shook slightly as he lifted a heavy steel plate. "You doing okay?" Travis asked. Derek forced a weak smile. "Just tired, been pulling doubles all week, we're short-staffed." "How many people are supposed to be on the shift?" "8, Derek said. "We've got 5. Travis clenched his jaw. That explained a lot. Hours passed, the heat and labor wearing on him. He was rusty, but his muscle memory kicked in. He hadn't welded in years, but he could still handle the basics. At one point, he noticed Derek swaying slightly. "Hey man, you need a break." "I'm fine," Derek muttered. Then, without warning, Derek's knees buckled. He collapsed onto the concrete floor, his welding torch clattering beside him. Travis dropped his own tools and rushed forward. "Derek, hey." Ray barely glanced over. "He'll be fine, just push some water on him." Travis gritted his teeth. "We need to get him out of here." Another worker, a woman named Lisa, ran over with a bottle of water. "He's been running on fumes for days." Travis helped Derek sit up, his skin clammy and pale. "How long has this been happening?" Lisa lowered her voice. "Too long. Every time someone quits, management just piles the extra work on us. No new hires, no overtime pay, we're drowning." Travis looked around, his stomach twisting. He had built this company to be different, to be better, and yet, right in front of him, his workers were being pushed past their limits. He needed to see more before making his next move, but one thing was already clear. Something had gone terribly wrong in his company, and it was time to fix it. Derek sat on an overturned crate, his breathing shallow as he sipped from the water bottle Lisa handed him. His hands trembled slightly, the exhaustion etched into every movement. Travis crouched beside him, studying his face. Derek wasn't just tired, he was completely drained. Ray, the shift lead, barely spared them a glance before turning back to his work. The man had been in the industry long enough to recognize burnout when he saw it. yet he acted like this was normal. Travis knew better. Lisa nudged Derek's shoulder. "You need to go home, man." Derek shook his head. "Can't, rent's due next week. I need the hours." Travis frowned. He knew the company paid decent wages, or at least it was supposed to. But if workers were this desperate to rack up extra shifts, something wasn't adding up. Lisa muttered under her breath, "Not worth getting yourself killed over." Travis stood, stretching out the tightness in his back. He'd been working for hours, and the strain was catching up to him. But unlike Derek, he wasn't on his second or third double shift. If he was feeling it, he couldn't imagine what these workers were pushing through daily. A loud crash echoed from across the shop floor. A metal sheet had slipped off a workbench, narrowly missing another welder's foot. The worker cursed, shaking his head as he repositioned the material. No one reacted beyond a few muttered complaints. It was as if near misses were just part of the job now. Travis wiped sweat from his forehead. He needed to dig deeper. He turned to Lisa. "Who's in charge when Ray's not around?" She huffed, "Mike, but good luck getting anything out of him. If you bring up problems, he'll either ignore you or tell you to toughen up. Same with Ray." Travis had seen enough bad management in his years to know that when shift leads ignored safety concerns, it usually meant higher-ups were pressuring them to keep productivity up at any cost. He glanced back at Derek, who was rubbing his temples. "Go home," Travis said firmly. "One shift's pay isn't worth your health." Derek hesitated but finally nodded. Lisa helped him up, and they made their way toward the break room. Travis turned back to the workstations, his mind racing. He needed to see how deep the problems ran. For the next few hours, he kept his head down, watching and listening. Conversations between workers painted a bleak picture, welders talking about skipping doctor visits because they couldn't afford the time off, employees calling in sick and getting guilt-tripped into coming in anyway, and a general feeling that management didn't care as long as the work got done. Then there was the equipment. Some of the welding rigs were outdated, and at least one had faulty wiring. He overheard a guy named Marcus joke that the machine had shocked him twice last week. No one laughed. By the time the shift neared its end, his frustration had reached a breaking point. As the workers started cleaning up, Travis spotted Ray heading toward the office. He followed, waiting until the door shut before knocking. Ray didn't even look up from his clipboard. "What?" Travis leaned against the doorframe. "I got a question. How often do we get new hires? Because from what I'm seeing, we're running this place on fumes." Ray let out a short laugh. "We get new hires all the time. They don't last." Travis crossed his arms. "Why not?" Ray finally looked up, his expression hard. "Because they can't handle real work. They show up, realize it's not a cushy desk job, and quit." Travis kept his face neutral, but inside, his irritation grew. He'd heard this line before management blaming turnover on lazy workers instead of looking at how they were treating their employees. "They're quitting because they're being worked into the ground," Travis said. "Derek passed out today, and you barely reacted." Ray shrugged. "It happens, he'll be fine." "You're running 5 people on an 8-person shift," Travis pressed. "That's not just bad luck, that's bad management." Ray's jaw tightened. "You don't know how things work here, new guy." Travis held his gaze. "Maybe not, but I know when something's broken." Ray scoffed and turned back to his clipboard. "If you don't like it, there's the door." Travis took a slow breath, forcing himself to stay calm. He wasn't here to argue, he was here to understand. But what he'd seen so far was enough to make his decision clear. He pushed off the doorframe. "See you next shift." Walking back onto the shop floor, he spotted Lisa wiping down a welding table. He approached her. "If I wanted to talk to someone about pay issues," he asked, "who would I go to?" Lisa snorted. "Good luck with that. Mike handles payroll, but he's not exactly helpful. People have been complaining about missing overtime pay for months, but nothing changes. Travis's stomach sank. Missing overtime pay? That wasn't just negligence, that was theft. He gave Lisa a nod and headed toward the break room. He needed to see the payroll reports himself. If what Lisa said was true, this wasn't just about bad working conditions. It was about people being cheated. Travis waited until the last workers left before stepping into the small office tucked in the back of the warehouse. The space was cramped, the desk cluttered with loose papers and half-empty coffee cups. A battered filing cabinet stood against the far wall, its drawers slightly ajar. Mike, the shop's manager, sat behind the desk, tapping away at a computer. He barely glanced up when Travis entered. "What do you need?" Mike asked, his voice flat. Travis leaned casually against the doorway. Had a question about payroll. Some of the guys mentioned issues with overtime pay. Mike's fingers paused on the keyboard before he sighed and leaned back in his chair. "Look, we process payroll the same way every week. If someone says they're missing overtime, they probably just don't understand how it's calculated." Travis kept his expression neutral. Lisa mentioned it's been happening for months. Mike's eyes narrowed slightly. Lisa talks too much. Travis let a beat of silence stretch between them. He knew that tone dismissive, defensive. It wasn't the response of someone who wanted to fix a problem. It was the response of someone who didn't want to be questioned. Mike exhaled sharply. "We're running tight shifts. Sometimes the system has glitches. It gets corrected eventually." Travis's patience thinned. "You're saying it's just an error?" Mike shrugged. "Payroll's complicated. People always think they're owed more than they are." That was enough. Travis stepped forward, his presence shifting from casual to commanding. "Then, show me the records." Mike frowned. "Why do you care?" "Because, don't like seeing people work themselves into the ground for pay they are not getting." Mike hesitated, his fingers twitching slightly against the desk. Then, after a long pause, he sighed and turned the monitor slightly so Travis could see. "Fine, here, but you'll see there's no issue." Travis scanned the screen. The payroll report listed hours worked, but something stood out immediately. Several employees had their overtime hours capped just below the threshold for time and a half pay. It wasn't a system glitch. It was deliberate. He straightened, his tone even. "These guys are working over 40 hours, but the system logs them at 39 and a half. That's not an accident." Mike's jaw tightened. "That's above my pay grade. I just follow what I'm told." Travis's chest burned with frustration. "Who told you to do this?" Mike shook his head. "Does it matter?" Travis took a slow breath, keeping his temper in check. "Yeah, it does." Mike hesitated again, then muttered, "Kevin." Travis's stomach turned. The district manager. The same man who'd brushed off all his concerns, blaming turnover on the workers instead of looking at the real issues. Mike shifted uneasily in his chair. "Kevin doesn't want payroll getting too high, says we have to keep the budget tight." Travis clenched his fists. This wasn't just mismanagement, it was exploitation. Without another word, he turned and left the office. He'd seen enough. The next morning, he arrived early, wearing his usual suit instead of his undercover work gear. The moment he stepped into the shop floor, eyes turned toward him. Workers paused, glancing at each other with confusion. Ray spotted him first. His brows furrowed and he started toward him. "What's going on?" Travis didn't waste time. "Call everyone in, now." Ray hesitated but nodded, barking orders. Within minutes, the entire shift stood in a loose circle, uncertainty written across their faces. Lisa's gaze flickered with recognition, her posture stiffening. Derek, still pale but back on his feet, looked equally wary. Travis took a slow breath, then spoke. "I'm Travis Ellison. I own this company." A ripple of shock moved through the group. Eyes widened, heads turned. Ray's face drained of color. Travis let the silence hang before continuing. Came here undercover because I wasn't getting the truth. I needed to see it for myself. He turned his gaze to Derek. I watched one of my own workers collapse from exhaustion while management acted like it was normal. Derek looked down, shifting uncomfortably. Lisa folded her arms, her expression unreadable. Travis's voice hardened. I watched good workers being pushed past their limits while being cheated out of their pay. His eyes locked onto Mike, who had just stepped out of the office, his face tight with panic. Mike opened his mouth, but Travis cut him off. I saw the payroll records. I know about the overtime theft. I know exactly who's responsible. The tension in the room thickened. Ray's jaw tightened, but he didn't speak. Travis turned toward the workers again. This stops today. Effective immediately, anyone owed back pay will be compensated in full, every missing dollar. The workers exchanged glances, disbelief flickering across their faces. Travis wasn't done. He turned to Ray. You knew what was happening. You let it slide. You ignored safety risks and treated exhaustion like it was a minor inconvenience. Ray's mouth pressed into a thin line. You're done here, Travis said, effective immediately. Ray's face darkened, but he didn't argue. He knew there was no point. Travis shifted his focus to Mike. You followed orders, but you knew it was wrong. You had a choice, and you made the wrong one. Mike swallowed hard. You're done too, Travis said coldly. A heavy silence followed. Then he turned back to the workers. Things change now. We're hiring more staff. No more skeleton crews, no more cutting corners, and no more unpaid overtime. If you have concerns, I want them brought to me directly. Lisa exhaled sharply, her posture finally relaxing. Derek's shoulders sagged with relief. Around the group, workers exchanged glances, the disbelief slowly giving way to cautious hope. Travis met each gaze. This company was built to be better than this, and I promise you it will be. The weight of silence hung in the air as the reality of Travis's words settled over the workers. Some exchanged glances, unsure whether to believe what they had just heard. Others looked at him with cautious optimism, as if waiting for the moment the promises would be taken back. Lisa was the first to speak. Her voice was steady, but there was an edge to it. We've heard promises before. What makes this different? Travis met her gaze without hesitation. Because this time, I'm holding myself accountable, and if I ever let things slide again, I want you all to call me out on it. A murmur rippled through the group. Some of the older workers nodded slowly, while the younger ones watched him closely, measuring his sincerity. Derek, still pale from the previous day's collapse, shifted his stance. So, what happens now? Travis turned toward him, his expression firm. First, I'm making sure you and everyone else gets every dollar they are owed. I've already called my finance team. They're pulling the records, and by the end of the week, every missing paycheck will be corrected. If anyone has any discrepancies, they can report them directly to me. Derek's shoulders eased slightly. Lisa crossed her arms. And what about the workload? 5 people can't do the job of 8 forever. Travis nodded. I've already approved emergency hiring. We'll bring in new welders and fabricators immediately. In the meantime, we'll reduce shift lengths, even if it means slowing down production. No more pushing people past their limits. A few workers exchanged surprised glances. The idea of slowing production was unheard of. Ray and Mike stood off to the side, their expressions unreadable. They both knew there was no way out of this. There were no excuses left to make. Travis turned to them one final time. You both failed the people who work here. You let this place turn into a pressure cooker, and you let greed dictate your decisions. I won't allow that anymore. Neither man responded. They knew it was over. Travis exhaled, steadying himself before looking back at the welders. I started this company because I believed in hard work, but hard work should never come at the cost of safety or dignity. I lost sight of what was happening here, and that's on me, but I promise you, I won't let this happen again. Lisa studied him for a long moment, then gave a small nod. Derek seemed to relax for the first time since Travis had met him. One of the older welders, a man with deep lines on his face and calloused hands, finally spoke. "We'll hold you to that." Travis nodded. "Good, you should." The tension in the room shifted. It wasn't gone, but something in the air felt different. A crack in the wall of distrust. Travis turned toward the office, already thinking about the next steps. Fixing the payroll issues was just the beginning. He needed to overhaul the entire management structure, bring in people who actually understood what leadership meant. As he walked through the shop, he took in the worn-down equipment, the outdated tools, the small signs of neglect that had built up over time. This wasn't just about one bad manager or one broken system, it was about rebuilding the foundation of his company. He had work to do, and this time he would make sure he did it right. Travis stepped into his office for the first time since going undercover, his mind already racing through the next steps. The past 48 hours had revealed more than just mismanagement. It had exposed a system that had been slowly corroding from within. He had spent years building this company, but somewhere along the way, he had let distance grow between himself and the people who made it run. That was going to change. His assistant, Claire, looked up as he entered. She had been with him for nearly a decade and had an uncanny ability to read his mood. "I assume the reports were worse than expected," she said, setting down her tablet. Travis sat heavily in his chair, rubbing his temples. "Worse doesn't even cover it." Claire pulled up a document on her screen. "I already started digging into payroll records. It's bad. Overtime adjustments have been happening for at least a year. Whoever was handling approvals didn't even try to hide it." Travis exhaled sharply. "I want every affected worker compensated immediately. No delays, no excuses." Claire nodded. "Already in motion. But that's just one piece of the problem. Hiring is another. You can't just throw job postings online and expect people to line up after what's been happening at that shop." Travis leaned forward. "Then we change the approach. Better wages, better hours, and a real reason for people to trust us again." Claire hesitated. "It's going to take time. The damage isn't just financial, it's cultural." Travis knew she was right. Fixing payroll and hiring more workers was just the beginning. The deeper wounds ran through leadership, trust, and the way people had been conditioned to accept mistreatment as part of the job. "Then we start with the people who are still here," he said. "I want a meeting with every shop lead across all locations. In person, no exceptions." Claire made a note. "That's going to take some serious scheduling, but I'll make it happen." Travis stood. "I'm heading back to the shop. I need to see how the team is holding up." Claire didn't try to stop him. She knew him well enough to understand that he wouldn't be sitting behind a desk when there was work to do. The warehouse was quieter than before, but the tension still lingered. Workers were adjusting to the sudden shift in leadership, and not everyone was convinced that real change was coming. Lisa was at her station, adjusting a welding torch. When she saw Travis approach, she didn't look away, but she didn't rush to speak either. "You're back fast," she said, glancing at him. Travis nodded. "This isn't a one-time fix." She adjusted the settings on her torch, her expression guarded. "A lot of people have heard promises before, not just here, everywhere." Travis understood. Years of bad management had conditioned workers to expect disappointment. "That's why I'm not just making promises," he said. "I'm making changes." She studied him for a moment before nodding slightly. "We'll see." Derek was nearby, handling a metal sheet with more care than before. He still looked worn down, but he wasn't on the verge of collapse anymore. "You feeling any better?" Travis asked. Derek wiped his hands on his jeans. "Yeah, took a full night's sleep for the first time in weeks." Travis crossed his arms. That should never have been a luxury. Derek gave a small nod. "Guess we'll see if it sticks." The skepticism wasn't surprising. Trust wouldn't be rebuilt overnight. Travis scanned the shop floor, taking in the small but noticeable shifts. Workers weren't rushing as much. There was still tension, but the frantic, desperate energy had eased. It wasn't enough. "Where's the equipment checklist?" Travis asked. Lisa pointed toward a clipboard hanging near the tool station. "Right there, not that anyone's checked it in months." Travis walked over, flipping through the pages. Half the machines hadn't been inspected in over 6 months. Welding rigs that should have been replaced were still in use. "That changes today," he muttered. Lisa glanced over. "What, we're actually getting new equipment?" Travis turned to her. "Yes, and I want you and the team to make a list of what's needed. No more working with outdated tools." She raised an eyebrow. "You're serious?" "As serious as I was about getting you paid what you're owed." For the first time, he saw a flicker of something close to belief in her eyes. Travis turned back to the floor, already thinking of the next steps. Fixing payroll was one thing, fixing trust was another. And he wasn't stopping until both were done.